Hello everybody, time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Tonight's story, Ned Finch, number 2. Hello, last night we made our scrapbook open to a page about the fabulous Ned Finch, and tonight we're going to read a few more lines from that calico biography. We said last night that Ned, that is Edward C. Finch, was about as close to a diamond Jim Brady as the harbor had ever known. He was other things too. He was a Billy Rose, an Andrew Carnegie, and in some respects a Howard Hughes. People who knew Ned Finch were never surprised when he came up with a new one, and he never disappointed them. Never. I think we'd gotten Ned along to the affluence that came with the building of Grays Harbor's first so-called skyscraper, the Finch Building. From there on, his ups and downs came faster. While Finch was what might be called comfortably situated after his Finch Building promotion, he was not satisfied to play his hand conservatively. He had to speculate in this and that. He never really owned his Finch Building. Its stock was usually in hock for one of his newer ventures. But before we tell you about his big strike, there's a yarn about his fighting prowess that ought to be told. It has to do with a dance hall and the town pug, Charlie Johnson, who ran the Palace of Pleasures. The dance hall, in addition to being Aberdeen's gayest spot after dark, was also one of the places where the gentry dropped in for a nightcap after a lodge meeting or a business conference or a civic improvement conclave. One night Finch joined the boys for a late topper at Charlie Johnson's place. They elbowed and polished mahogany and savored Charlie's selected brand and bantered back and forth, with Finch becoming quite talkative, and something of a big fellow said must have offended Charlie Johnson. Anyhow, the manager of the palace and the promoter of the Finch Building had some ugly words. Only mutual friends kept the two from tangling right there. When Finch left, it was with fire in his eyes. Now, old-timers will tell you that Finch was a great bluffer, but of course Charlie Johnson was not one to bluff easily. And when Finch was outside walking away with his friends, he bluffed more bravely. Why, he told his companions, I should have licked him right then and there. I should have torn him apart. His friends encouraged his state of mind. They pointed out that Ned was a big man, as big as Charlie. Of course, he was out of his conduit, Ned that is, but a little heavy work put him back into shape. And if he really was in shape, he could polish off Charlie Johnson with one hand. The more they talked, the more Ned Finch began to become convinced. He talked louder. He blustered. When they retired to the Our House bar run by the Bose brothers down on Heron Street, he was ready to go back and tear Charlie Johnson to pieces. Well, to be brief, the talk went around the town for several days that Ned Finch had promised to give Charlie Johnson the licking of his life. Incidentally, this was before Captain Whitconnott did just that in the memorable battle in the old Palm Palace. People stopped Finch and asked when it was going to come off. They slapped him on the back and encouraged him. They built him up. Finally, his friend L.L. Malley, maker of the famous Pioneer cigar that gave its name to the landmark of Think of Me Hill cigar, finally Malley talked him into training for the fight. Malley offered the back room of his cigar factory for the gymnasium. Other friends picked up a punching bag, collected weights to lift, found a pair of gym trunks for him, and Finch went into training. Some people might think that Ned Finch started the venture with his tongue in his cheek. If he did, he soon became serious about it. In no time at all, he was doing a spell of road work. After dark, of course, and when he pummeled the bag and skipped rope in the gym, a crowd of admirers looked on and applauded. The word went all over town. Finch is training to fight Charlie Johnson. If Charlie heard the news, he may or may not have laughed. Ned Finch was so small-sized, he had no mean bluffer. Well, the first whirl of excitement was over when one evening a clique of Finch's friends met him at Mally's cigar store. Finch was looking fit. His training had actually trimmed him down, brought color to his cheeks. He looked like he might make a good about his boast. "What about tonight?" they asked him. "Tonight's the night to take on Charlie Johnson." The more they talked, the more convincing it sounded, and finally, when the cigar smoke was thick and Finch had been well built up by his companions, he was convinced. Moving at the head of the growing crowd, he headed for the dance hall. As they crossed the plank streets and waded through the sawdust, the crowd buzzed. Young Earl Morgan had been selling newspapers and was on his way home when he passed the group talking loudly. He called to his newsboy friends and followed as they started across Hume Street. The lights of the dance hall shone brightly through the smoked-up windows, and the sounds of fiddling orchestra with the tooting horn carried through the night air. Straight to the big double doors walked Ned Finch and swung them open boldly. Inside them was a meager crowd that was scattered around the hall. A few danced. The bar was lined, and behind the bar, wearing an apron, was Charlie Johnson. He did not appear to see Finch as a contender when he walked in, but without a demonstration, he untied the apron and walked around the end of the bar. He met Finch as they came together in mid-floor. Finch stopped. He thrust his hands on his hips and started to say something. "I should have said this thing out with you the other night. At least, that is what friends thought he was going to say." But he never finished. Without waiting for the preliminary remarks, Charlie Johnson swung from the shoulder. The late Earl Morgan, who lived in and faithfully recalled the early days happening of sawdust Aberdeen, once remarked, "There were just 2 blows struck. Charlie hit Finch, and Finch hit the floor." Finch's friends looked down at the fallen champ with stunned silence. He reclined for a long moment on one elbow, his hands over his bruised chin. Charlie Johnson turned and walked behind the bar, retied on his apron. Finch slowly got up from the floor. As he rose, his dignity returned. His voice came back, not loudly. "Hit a man when he's not looking. He didn't give me a chance." But Finch didn't want any more. He picked up his hat. His voice grew louder as his henchmen followed him out the door, shaking their heads. But behind the bar, Charlie Johnson threw back his head and roared a hearty, scoffing laugh that was taken up by everyone in the place. The laugh echoed across Hume Street as Finch ambled through the sawdust, surrounded by reassuring friends. That was another side of Ned Finch, the side that saw failure full and close and had to take it. But it was not always so. It was after the First World War that Finch's fortunes went to a new low. He tried several schemes to recoup, but they didn't work. He finally took a trip over into Montana to promote a mine. When he returned, his old Dodge car was covered with the grime of many miles, and Finch himself looked as worn out and tired as his car. He sold the car for $100 and dropped into the Hayes and Hayes Bank for a conference with Billy Patterson. But Billy wasn't there. Jim Fuller was, however, and Finch told Jim his story. He was going to go to California. Finch's sister had married Joe Dabney, the early-day partner of the Aberdeen promoter, and they now lived in California. Joe had prospered through his promotions, and his capacity for holding on to his dollar was greater than his brother-in-law. Finch could see a distant promotion that might pay off well. Now Finch had dropped into the Hayes and Hayes, too, to talk about his promotion, but that part that he wanted to discuss most was a small loan, say about $3,500. When Billy wasn't there, he took it up with Jim Fuller. Now, Jim admired Finch, as one admires a man with the audacity and capacity of a promoter, but he knew him well enough to consider him not too sound of risk for a loan of that proportion. He said no firmly, and that ended it. However, the next morning, when Patterson was back, Finch showed up again. "Out of the way, old marble face," he told Jim Fuller, and walked right into Peterson's office. There was loud talking, Jim recalls on this day, lots of loud talking, and when Finch came out, he had a draft for $500. "Cash this, old marble face," he told Fuller, and poked the draft through the wicket windows. With his new found financing, the promoter was gone. Destination California. Objective oil wells. Now, just how he located and rounded up land that brought him his new wealth is not certain, but he was unsuccessful in getting in on the Signal Hill oil venture outside Long Beach. He found that was a big money gain, and a man with $500 couldn't go far. However, his brother-in-law, Joe Dabney, assured him that he could get a hold of some lands that showed promise. He, Joe, would drill for him, and they would split the profits if it brought in oil. Finch got the lands that even most optimistic geologists had passed on as no good. Dabney put up the money and they drilled. And as some of you may recall, and the rest of you can guess, he hit it rich. In came a gusher. The most fabulous dreams of wealth spewed out of the field of California, and Finch's luck was on the upgrade. One morning, Jim Fuller looked up at his teller's cage in the Hayes and Hayes Bank. There stood Finch. "Cash this, old marble face," said the promoter, as he thrust a check for $35,000 through the window. From that day on, Finch's luck was all good. His income varied from $35,000 to $55,000 a month, and he spent it with the relish of a man who had spent his life trying to hit the jackpot. He toured Europe. With the splendor of the American nobleman, he sailed for Europe and did the continent. He bought art objects with lavish abandon. Crates of Italian marbles, fine paintings, and valuable collectible items began to arrive in Grays Harbor. When he returned in the wake of his treasure trove, he had an apartment constructed for himself on the top floor of the building that bore his name, but which was no longer his. He filled it with overflowing with European art. From the windows of his apartment, he could look out over the undeveloped lands of South Aberdeen. He got an idea. He would start some small acreage farms for people who wanted to truck farm and live in town. Finch's farms became his pet project, and roads crisscrossed the cleared acreage. Model homes went up. He built a school. No one could accuse Grays Harbor's finest of selfishness for his fortune. In fact, it seemed that he thought first of everyone else, though those who knew him well would doubt it. However, he went from one charitable project to another. The Boy Scout movement was in its infancy on the harbor. Edward Reed Bailey Parkins was the first full-time executive. "We could form a band if we had instruments," he told Finch. "Go buy the instruments," was the retort, "and get an instructor too. I'll pay for it." And he did. He outfitted a 32-piece band with imported Italian bandmaster P.J. Caraba, the youngest of the town, got a dose of music such as they had never dreamed of. Someone suggested a playfield. It didn't take much more than that. He lavished money on the project, furnished swings, buildings, a pool, and paraphernalia, and wrote a check to cover it. Finch Playfield came into being. He wanted to venture and went from venture to venture like a man having the fling of his life, and no one doubted that it was just what was happening. And so Edward C. Finch came down the home stretch of his colorful life at the full speed he had maintained since the first day he saw Grays Harbor. When he died in the early 1930s, he had lived the span of Grays Harbor constructive history. In his affluent days, he had been a state senator, a millionaire, a small-town tycoon, and a philanthropist. In his down-and-out days, he had been one of Grays Harbor's greatest boosters, the promoter who kept his own interests first in mind. But perhaps Billy Patterson's creed also applied to him. What helped Ned Finch helped Grays Harbor. His friends would tell you that he'd quibble of a 65-cent subscription to the Elks magazine in 1 minute and give $10,000 to run a friend for public office in the next minute. And through it all, he was without doubt one of the personalities that will always remain important in this, our hometown scrapbook. Thank you for listening.